So inevitably, and this is the last kind of background slide what we'll get at, inevitably, this is the overall goal, where you're writing in DITA directly, you're storing the topics and conrefs into a repository where they can be managed independently, and then you're pushing out that single source topic to multiple outputs. And we see that everyone's striving towards that, but there's a natural evolution to this. And going to DITA means very different things. It starts with converting your content to DITA and editing directly in it, and then automatically applying formatting. So if your content is converted to DITA and you have style sheets to reproduce, let's just say, a printed output, that's the first phase. And there's no sense, and we get into implementation details in other presentations, of skipping ahead to content management if you can't have that basic DITA conversion in place. Once you have that basic conversion and you have an XLFO, let's say, to PDF, then you look at publishing different versions using profiling and then adding other XSLT or other transformations to have other formats. And that's what the custom publishing is. That's really when you start seeing the return on your data conversion investment. And again, we recommend and we push getting that right before you move to a content management software. Because if you don't have the inputs right for the editing and you don't have the publishing process right for the profiling and the different formats as an output, you really can't get the content management piece right, which controls the inputs and the outputs. And the third then is moving to a dedicated content management system that manages the workflow, the reuse. It can start tracking some of the metrics. However, we see a lot of successful DITA implementations not needing to go through all the way to content management. They can either stop at automatic formatting, move on to custom publishing, and then it's a big jump to content management, but it's not required to have a successful system to jump there first. And the last step is really what people are striving towards. It's to switch around the distribution of the content that's in the content management system. When you're in a content management system, the internal resources, the technical writers, the information managers, the product managers are deciding what a user guide is. They're deciding what languages to translate. They're packing up and they're creating the DITA maps for distribution. We're seeing there's a lot of excitement in creating consumer-based user interfaces that allows them to pick and choose the topics that they want, to allow them to choose the profiling options, and for them to provide the format that they want it. And so the first question we have after we've gone through this background, and we've introduced ourselves from Just Systems to Dakota Systems, is to ask you as the attendees, where are you, if you are using DITA, along this process? Have you converted to DITA and you're using style sheets outside of a CMS? Are you using profiling for custom publishing? Have you migrated to a content management system? And then the last step, are you allowing people outside of your company to go in and pull into your content management system and build content themselves via this dynamic content assembly? So that's going to be the first poll questions before we get into the meat of the presentation. So Avi, can you submit that?
Yeah, it's running. Just waiting for answers.
Okay, great. So as we're going through that, I think, and also now would be a time if there's any questions that you think are relevant to the background of what DITA is and and the importance of DITA publishing. And because now we're getting into really where we are at the beginning of this presentation, where you already understand thoroughly your work process, you understand your content, you understand DITA. It makes perfect sense to you. You know the tools that can be used. You have some idea of the cost that's involved, but you're still getting some internal resistance. And there's many areas, like day in and day out, we found we build as a company, or we propose systems that are very, very clear in our minds that would improve their internal processes, whether it's for a tech pubs group, a commercial publisher, or other industries. But we see the same resistance coming over and over again. And some of the most common ones that we see over and over again are, DITA's too expensive from a budgetary manager. It's too complex from a technical writer. It's too generic. You should spend the time either to specialize it, but then it's too complicated to specialize it. Let's build our own custom DTD. Or from an internal solutions architect saying it's not our standard. So as we looked at this, it's really a shame that if we go through the trouble, we really find a solution that's better for a company, that and many times we even have enough momentum that something has to be done to solve the problem. This is what we talked about, getting that momentum just to get a project approved in the first webinar, that it fizzles out because there's some descent into the path that we go to. So when we look at these, there's two basic arguments. One is really an argument against XML-based single source in general, and then DITA-specific arguments. And when you look back at some of the resistance that we've seen, DITA is too expensive. The first thing you should think about anytime you hear a piece of resistance is to see which category it falls into. And DITA is too expensive really rarely has anything to do with DITA. They're talking about XML publishing in general. DITA is too complex. Well, again, that could be not so much a testament or statement against DITA as it is about XML editing versus maybe a technical writer coming from Word or unstructured frame. DITA is too generic, and DITA is not our standard. Those are examples of people that are built in, or they buy into XML single source publishing, but they disagree with DITA as a standard. And as you can imagine, that as we go from year to year to year, the distribution of resistance, it kind of shifts. I mean, we're kind of moving past this idea that XML applied to technical publications isn't the best way of handling it. But there's been a little bit of resistance, especially if they've already tried this. Maybe they use DocBook, maybe they use another standard, maybe they paid a lot of money for a custom DTD to move to DITA at this point. So this is the first thing to do anytime you see some resistance, is to see, are you really arguing about DITA or the underlying architecture? And we spent a lot of time, and we had a lot of success kind of dissecting the arguments and not making the mistake of arguing against DITA when they're really talking about XML or vice versa. But more recently, we see that the resistance is coming from two different areas. It's not what the arguments are here, it's where they're coming from. And this is where the title comes from. They're coming from people who really don't know anything about DITA, and it's not their job to, or to be a technical expert, but they will deny, refuse, or oppose DITA based on authority. Or a person who will say it's not possible, and they have very specific technical reasons why DITA is not the right solution. And not surprisingly, when we looked at these two categories, this is, according to Merriam-Webster, exactly what a naysayer is. It is a person who denies, refuses, or opposes something, or a person who says something will not work or is not possible. And those are exactly the two categories that we see. When we look back, we're having a pretty high success of getting DITA publishing systems in place when they make sense, but it's still not 100%. And of those situations, because of non-technical reasons, a project is deferred or canceled, it inevitably falls into one of those two categories. So the first one to look at And it's really the most important. And it's worth noting that if we were to look back on our projects that were deferred or canceled, where we were proposing a DITA implementation, you can imagine, and actually I changed it for this webinar, that the person who says something will not work or not possible 5 years ago, 6 years ago, 4 years ago, right as the standard was emerging, that was the more prominent source of resistance that was successful. Now it's harder to say that there's not acceptance in the vendor community for software. It's harder to say that it's not going to work in their industry. It's harder to say that there's not XSLT or the DITA Open Toolkit has flaws, or there's XSLFO technology isn't really where it needs to be to meet the PDF outputs. So that becomes secondary at this point. Most of the resistance that's successful comes from, that sounds silly, but people who know nothing about DITA, and they don't really care about DITA. But they are in a position of authority to deny, refuse, or oppose an implementation. And the three guys, and I say guys meaning men or women, that we encounter when we're trying to put in a system, and this is after a company agrees that something has to be done, and after we've done the legwork and we're convinced that DITA is the right technical approach, are the CFO, budget manager, solutions architect, or the software vendor. And the first one to look at, and we spent a lot of time talking about this in the first webinar, it's making sure, and there's a lot being written about this because it's a very interesting topic, to translate the technical advantages of DITA into the financial advantages that can be approved in an internal budget office. And in general, the first thing is it has to be done. And I don't want to rehash a lot of what we talked about in the first webinar for those of you that sat in there, but there's two points. One is that it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. If you're jumping into coming up with an ROI or coming up with DITA metrics before you have some idea of how to explain this in one sentence, why does it make sense to go to DITA? It's to reduce translation costs. Or why are you going to that? We have a new product that's sold in Saudi Arabia and we need to convert to Arabic. Or we need a iOS application for an iPad and we need a structured way, an automatic way of converting. There should be one sentence, non-financial, non-technical way of describing the need before you jump into this level. And the second is, before you get into all the details, and we have examples of spreadsheets that have been successful, and there's lots of them available where you can fill out all these little details. The second point is you have to come up with an agreement on how you're going to value the cost savings. And this is one, it's simple, that we use over and over again. It's not getting into a lot of detail, and it's generally accepted. And it includes a couple things that are worth noting. The first is, as a point of agreement for what the ROI calculation will be, and that's sometimes 90% of the battle, because if you can articulate that you actually understand a reasonable way of valuing the cost savings, everything else kind of falls into place. But there's 4 things that you have to have a clear understanding of before you start talking to these budgetary managers. And one is, what's the cost of implementation? It sounds silly, but you have to know how much the software is going to cost. You have to know how much the data conversion is going to be. You have to know how much the training is going to be, the style sheet development. You have to know how much the hardware is going to be. You have to know how much the internal resources are cost, how much external resources are cost, and whether you count those figures or not. Time that you spend from your real life job putting in one of these systems, does that count or does it not count? And it doesn't really matter what the answer is, it's what's accepted in your organization. So you have to have an agreement on what the cost is. And you shouldn't be foolish and say that it's $10,000 or $20,000 if you're going to have 5 technical writers spending 10% of their time over the next 4 months working on something.